Hey guys, welcome to episode 5 of Multi-Table Tournaments from the Ground Up. This time we are going to be focusing on bet sizing, the basics of it. So we are going to go through why it's important, and I'm just going to give you some basic guidelines for pre-flop and show you kind of the things you want to be thinking about post-flop with bet sizing as well. So let's get straight into it. Okay, so why is it important? There's quite a few reasons why bet sizing is important. So I'm just going to go through a few of them here. It's a way that we get to manipulate the pot size. We're going to want to do that when we have good hands and we think we're going to get called by big bets, where we're going to want to bet big. If we think our opponent will fold for X amount but not for a smaller amount, then we want to go with the bigger sizing that will get them to fold with if we're intending to bluff. And then we get to do other things as well by manipulating the pot size. It's a way in which we get to give ourselves good odds or bad odds and give our opponent good odds or bad odds. If we bet small, not only do we give our opponent the incentive to call by giving him good odds, but we also give ourselves pretty good odds because we're betting a small amount. Say we bet 1/3 pot. We're betting, 1/3 to win 1, which is pretty good odds. And the same for our opponent. If we bet 1/3 pot, he only has to call 1/3 pot to win the entire pot potentially. We get to decide what kind of odds we're going to give ourselves plus give our opponent. It allows us to maximize value from our hand or from our range. Obviously, like I was saying, if you have good hands, we want to be betting bigger in general to be able to maximize our value. And the same goes for maximizing fold equity, like I was talking about as well. Another reason why it's important is we get to manipulate our opponent's range. And we're going to go into a lot more detail in an advanced bet sizing video later on in the course in the post-flop section, but just for now, just imagine a scenario where your opponent has a pretty wide range and you want to develop a strategy where you keep his range pretty wide and weak. Well, in that case, if you start betting big, what you're going to do is make your opponent's range strong and small, because he's not going to be getting particularly good odds to call with his weak hand, so he's just going to fold them. And that kind of brings us on to developing multi-street strategies, which you can use different bet sizings with the intention of using specific bet sizes on the next street, because you've manipulated your opponent's range in such a way that he's just going to get to the turn or the river with a range which you're going to be able to exploit, because you know it's either weak or it's strong because of your bet sizing on previous streets. Okay, so there's like a number of reasons why bet sizing is important. They're not the only reasons why bet sizing is important, but it's a general overview. So I'm just going to go into a few guidelines for pre-flop bet sizing. And these are the kind of ones that I tend to stick to myself. There are reasons that you want to deviate from these bet sizes, and they'll be kind of player-specific exploits. So I'll get to them in the 3-bet pots especially. So we'll just have a look at the pre-flop sizing, and then we'll talk a bit more about that. So when we're 100 big blinds plus deep, so very early in the tournaments generally, you're going to want to go 3 big blinds as an open size. 50 to 100 big blinds, somewhere around the region of 2.5 big blinds. It doesn't matter too much if you're going 2.2, if you're going 2.7, if you're going 3 big blinds, but I wouldn't go over 3 big blinds as a rule. Between 30 and 50 big blinds, going about 2.2x is pretty good. And then less than 30 big blinds deep, probably a min raise, but if you're going 2.2x, it doesn't really matter too much. You can deviate from these. So if you've got a very tight table who are just going to be folding way too often, even if you make it sort of 2.2x. Well, if you're 75 big blinds deep and that's the case, and you want to be opening a pretty wide range, then you can just min open or go 2.2x. And if it's going to achieve the same thing as going 3 big blinds, and you're opening a wide range, so you're not really looking to get called too often, well, then just go 2.2x. But you're not going to go too far wrong if you just follow these guidelines. Okay, so pre-flop 3 betting sizes. If we're going to be in position, we're usually going to go 3x their open, meaning that if they open for 3 big blinds, we're going to 3-bet to 9 big blinds. If we're in the small blind, we go 3.5x their open. So if they open to 3x, we 3-bet to about 10.5. And if we're in the big blind, if they open 3x, we're going to go 4x. So we're going to go to about 12 big blinds. If we're deeper stacked, you can potentially go bigger. Also, the reason why we 3-bet bigger when we're out of position, so in the blinds, is because our opponents are more incentivized to call us because they're going to have position. And if you've watched the positional video, which I assume you have, then you'll know that the player in position is going to have an advantage and going to realize their equity in a better way than out of position is going to. So they're more incentivized to call us. So for one, we get to generally 3-bet a tighter range out of position because we know we're going to have this positional disadvantage. But also we want to give our opponent worse odds because of their being incentivized to call. Whereas when we're in position, we don't mind a call quite as much because we're going to be the ones that have position, which means that we're going to realize our equity in a better way than our opponent. So we give them better odds to call so that we still gain that advantage. So when we're deeper stacked, we can go slightly bigger if we want. We don't have to, but there's certainly spots where, if they open and we're in position, I could certainly see going 3.5x or even 4x in position versus certain opponents. And then if we're shorter stacked, we can 3-bet smaller. So say we're in the small blind and we have, 27 big blinds. We're probably not going to want to make it 3.5x. We're going to go more like 3x. And the reason is that as stacks get shorter, the positional advantage is not as relevant because as we get to post-flop and the stacks are shorter, we generally get to realize our equity in a better way, even if we're out of position, because there's not as many opportunities for our opponent to actually have position on us. Most most flops are going to be, most pots are going to be all in by the flop or the turn, which means that our opponent's position is kind of negated in those kind of spots. So 3-betting smaller actually makes more sense and we give ourselves better odds. Plus, if we're trying to induce people, if we make it pretty big out of position, we give the impression that we're not going to have any, or that they're not going to have any fold equity. So there's a lot of little intricacies with 3-betting like that, which we'll cover a bit more in the pre-flop section. Okay. So we're going to go on to post-flop. I'm just going to give a general overview of post-flop c-betting sizes and then just give you some questions to ask yourselves. So we're going to do an advanced video, like I said, about c-betting or about post-flop sizing, in which we'll go into this stuff in more detail. But for now, I just wanted to give you the general sizes. One mistake that players tend to make, especially recreational new players, and then the questions that you kind of want to ask yourself when you're deciding how big to c-bet, or just bet post-flop in general. So the common sizings that we kind of come across these days in MTTs are 25% pot, 33% pot, 50%, 66%, 75%, or 100%. So that's a quarter, a third, a half, 2/3, 3/4, or 100% pot. All of these have different reasons for being used, but the biggest mistake that new players and recreational players and just some other players as well have in general is just using one bet size. So flop, they bet 50%, turn, they bet 50%, and then river, if they haven't sized it properly, they're left with either a really big bet or a really small bet, or just kind of somewhere in the middle and they're not quite sure what to do. We want to think past that. We always want to be thinking, like, what am I trying to achieve with this bet? And what you're trying to achieve might be just to get your opponent to fold a certain portion of their range. You might be trying to get maximum value out of their range. You might just be trying to size it so that we get to the river with a pot size bet left. There's lots of reasons why we choose bet sizes. Just make sure that you're thinking about why you're choosing this bet size. Don't just blindly bet 50%, 50%, 50%, because there's usually going to be better sizings that you can use, which is going to give you a better EV in the end, and maximize your win rate. So you always want to be thinking, like, am I betting for value? Am I betting for protection? Am I bluffing here? And for each of those reasons, you want to be thinking about what the best bet size is to use, whether you're developing a strategy just for this street or a multi-street strategy, which is kind of the one that you should always be thinking about. But think about what your aim is with this hand and what sizing suits that best. Finally, you always want to be thinking about your opponent's range and what part of it you're attacking. So, say you have the nuts, you want to be thinking, what hands does your opponent have that he can call with? And how often is he going to call those for each bet size? You know, if I bet 100% pot, say he's going to call, 10% of his range. But if I bet 2/3 pot, he's going to call with 50% of his range. Well, in general, it's going to be better to bet the 2/3 pot because you get called way more often, and the gains that you make by betting 100% pot aren't going to be worth it. So those are the kind of things that you need to be thinking about. And then if you're thinking about bluffing, like, how much of your opponent's range is actually made up of hands that are going to fold to a certain bet size, and is it worth betting that size? Could you bet smaller and get the same amount of folds? Could you bet bigger and get more folds? All those kind of things are what you need to be thinking about. Okay, so that's the kind of bet size basics that we're going to go through for this episode. Small bit of homework this week. Get to know the sizing guidelines, especially for the pre-flop. You can't go too far wrong using those guidelines that I've given you. There are obviously places to deviate, like I've said, but in general, those guidelines are going to work pretty well for you. And then for post-flop, just ask yourself what you're trying to achieve with your bet size. Just start thinking in that way, and you'll start training your brain to kind of automatically do that when you get to a post-flop situation. And think through all the different bet sizes and how they're going to kind of manipulate your opponent's range and get what you want from the hand. Okay, thanks for watching, guys. I will be back with episode 6 very soon.